Hi, I'm Raisah Ahmed. I'm a screenwriter and director based in Glasgow, and I'd like to welcome you to this Edinburgh TV Festival Creative Masterclass with Neil Gaiman and Douglas Mackinnon. So I find myself in a little bit of a I need to pinch myself moment here, I have to say, getting to speak to two incredible storytellers who have in some way been a part of my storytelling journey as well. I grew up watching a lot of what you've directed, Douglas, whether that's The Bill, those sort of early episodes, to Robin Hood. We were mad about Robin Hood in this house. The Flying Scotsman, Doctor Who, and more recently, Good Omens. And Neil, Sandman was my very first graphic novel fandom. And it was given to me by a friend because we could not afford to buy comic books. So a friend of mine lent it to me. And actually, the very same friend brought me to one of your book signings when the Anansi boys came out. So it feels a little bit like a wee full circle moment, and it's a bit of a dream to get to speak to you both. And we are brought here today specifically by the creative relationship you two have, as well as the creative relationship, Neil, you had with Terry in creating Good Omens. And in some ways, I guess the relationship that Aziraphale and Crowley have. So it's all about partnerships today, isn't it? And what that means in terms of building worlds and telling stories as well. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to start by taking us back to the beginning in the way that you do in Good Omens as well. Before the two of you started working together, and as far back as we can go, I guess, in that, what was that earliest sort of aha moment that you can recall where you knew that storytelling is what you wanted to do with your life? And did you know it was going to be the shape that it takes now?
I can answer the second part of the question more easily. No, I never expected this. I never planned for this. There was definitely a point as a young writer, and even as a young person who dreamed of becoming a writer, I was always just focused on the next hill. Could I get a short story written? Could I get a short story published? Could I sell a book? Could I, that, and it always felt like it had the potential to be a mirage and just fade away. And one day people would knock at the door and I would have to go and get a real job. So that was always on the horizon, and I never expected to be here. When did it start? I guess at school. Not as a result of anything that school was doing, but as a result of the fact that I was this mad reader who was at his happiest. His happy place would have been writing stories, would have been, when you got to write an essay and you got to make up stuff about people. That was my biggest joy. At the age when my friends were fantasizing about being astronauts or being super spies or whatever, I was fantasizing about kidnapping all of the writers who I loved and admired from the entirety of history so that I could get some of the dead ones too, and put them in a big castle and not tell them that it was me, because obviously I was, as a, 11-year-old boy, I was, way above suspicion, and make them collaborate on a huge novel and watch how they did it. That was where my head went. So I guess it goes back all the way.
And what about yourself, Douglas? I imagine you didn't grow up with a lot of directors around you.
No, I didn't. I grew up in the Isle of Skye. I realized in the last couple of years, I made my cleverest networking move when I was born, though, because I was born about 1.5 miles away from Neil's house on Skye. So that was a very clever move with benefit of hindsight. But no, the school in Portree, I remember there was a couple of moments when I realized that Santa didn't exist and I could ask for stuff. My mum was an English teacher and I asked for a pile of science fiction books. And I got, Bradbury and Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke and so on in a pile that Christmas Day. And that was fantastic. But the aha moment you're talking about, I suppose it was later when I was doing photography in school in Portree. And I found I discovered something that I actually wanted to do instead of other people telling me that it was good for me to do. And that's a big thing. You know, if you come across that in your life, anybody who's listening, you know, grab it, because it's quite a rare sort of moment. And I think the storytelling thing for me, I always was reasonably good at English, but was always making up stories that nobody wanted because they're all science fiction nonsense, as I was told. Where are they now?
Not so much nonsense anymore, are they? It's no. You know, science fiction makes the world go round these days, I would argue. I mean, Neil, you touched upon something really interesting there about that worry that somebody would find you out. Somebody would come and tell you, like, that's it, you need to go do something else. And I guess the kind of label we put on that often is imposter syndrome. And it's something I think I find is very common in a lot of my peers, whether they're kind of starting out, whether they've been doing this for years and years. That imposter syndrome, it feels like, is still there for them. I know I feel it almost on a daily basis sometimes. Is that something that you still find yourself feeling, I guess, and that's for both of you? And is there a way that you find yourself kind of combating that?
Yes, I still find it and fight it, but I'm often surprised at how much about the things that I actually think that I'm an imposter that I actually know. And I was finding that weirdly, I guess, working with Douglas on Good Omens a lot, because I'm coming into this going, I have never show run a TV show. I've written these scripts based on a book that I did with my friend Terry. I have genuinely no idea what I'm doing. People could be following me over a cliff. Douglas seems to know what he's doing. And I'm just going to follow him wherever it works. And then Douglas and I would bump heads on things. And he'd say, well, why are you doing this? What's going on with this? And I would have to answer. And what was fascinating for me was going, oh, I can answer. I actually know this. And it felt actually incredibly reassuring. Recently on Sandman, which is a TV series that I've been executive producing, I've really had to sort of come face to face with imposter syndrome, because we're making this giant TV series and people come to me, and I had to sort of acknowledge to myself that I am the human being on this planet who knows more about Sandman than anybody else. So, and I could answer the questions, and I could say, no, you don't do this because, and stuff. So that was weird.
And meanwhile, I was going about thinking, well, he's Neil Gaiman. He must know what he's talking about, so I'll just follow him. That's how it worked. Now, remember, Serena Williams, a month or so ago, was talking about the press conferences and so on that athlete had decided not to go to. And she said she reached a point where she realized that going into a press conference, that she knew more about tennis than anybody else in that room. I think that's what Neil is talking about, that nobody else knows about his work more than Neil Gaiman does. And I think I'm the same with directing. It's kind of, I think I know how to direct better than anybody else. That's the function of being a director, that you think you know better than anyone else, that you'll stand beside Spielberg and say, no, I think the camera should be slightly to the left here, Stephen. You know, but everybody suffers from imposter syndrome one way or another. Everybody.
I think it would be very reassuring for everyone watching to hear that actually you both still get those little bits of imposter syndrome, because if you get it, then it's okay if the rest of us get it as well. It's part of the process then, eh?
I think so, but I'd also say I've got a catchphrase that I use too often, which is somebody has to do it. You know, so somebody's got to turn up and write the book. Somebody's got to direct the telly. So why can't it be you? Yeah,
absolutely. That's a good way of looking at it, I would say. And I mean, that's a bit of advice. And so I guess what my next question is reflecting back on those sort of early days in your career and, you know, thinking about the moments before you got to the place where you thought, right, I'm doing this. This is my career. I'm making a living out of this. How did you find yourself kind of emotionally and mentally sustaining yourself to get to that point where the book started selling, where the directing job started coming in, and you didn't feel like you had to do 20 other jobs in order to sustain yourself?
The point is you never get to that point. You never actually ever get to that point. The point, for me, it's it's feeling comfortable about the thing that you're doing in front of you and trying to make sure that it's something that you love that you're doing, but also having that, whatever that dream is in the future, hanging around and keeping heading towards it. But if you're not, you've got to live in the moment and do the thing that's right in front of you. Go where you want it and do that thing.
Okay, so we're going to go to a question from one of your friends now. Stephen Fry has sent us in a question for Neil. So we'll play the question now.
Beloveds, forgive the beard, it's embarrassing but necessary for a part. Listen, here's a question. Really, I think Neil will, probably it's mostly for you, and for which I'm sorry, Douglas, and that's, there are generally considered to be two narrative modes, if I can put it that way, and they are usually described as showing and telling. And even within a novel or within a piece of written work, you can show something rather than tell it by having it happen rather than describing it, if you see what I mean. And we live in an age in which the spectacular and the image and the graphic and everything are privileged over the written, perhaps. But Neil, you write brilliantly in both forms. In the graphic novel, there's a lot of showing, that the words obviously indicate directions, but it's really about showing, both in language and yet in your books there's very often an equal measure of showing and telling. Anyway, I wondered if you feel you were put on this planet to be a shower or a teller. That sounds almost as if it was going to go into a very rude kind of comparison test. But anyway, I'll leave you with that. Sorry I can't be with you. Have a great time.
That's a wonderful question.
That's definitely for you, Neil. He was right.
He is, although I think there's a little bit that might wind up being for you as well, Douglas. I think that's such a great question. For me, at rock bottom, I guess I'm a teller. And I'm a teller because in my mind, the real function of a storyteller is we turn up in small communities a long time ago, and the way that we get fed and the way that we get a roof for the night is we say, let me tell you about Hercules. You must have heard of Hercules. No? Okay, well, this is a story you may not have heard about Hercules. And we tell. But the act of telling, if it is done right, is also an act of showing, because you are making your listener, you're making the people who are hearing your story build the story, create the story, people the story, light the story, shoot the story, cast the story, all of those things in their heads while they're listening. I love showing and I love telling. It's probably says something about me that I've only ever directed 2 films before I went, I'm really not a director. I'm really a writer. But one of the ones that I directed was a 10-minute long short film, a silent film, which was all about trying to show. But what I loved about it was whenever people described it back to me, they'd say, well, it's a poem, isn't it? And I thought it was lovely that they would take that metaphor as a way of explaining. When we did Good Omens, I actually loved the idea that every now and again, we would be telling, and that there would be a voice, the voice of God, as played by the amazing Frances McDormand, would be our teller. And so we actually begin Good Omens with an act of telling, not of showing. And then we had to come up with, we have our tell here. And then Douglas and I and the amazing Peter Anderson Studios had to come up with imagery that would reinforce the telling before we moved on into a showing.
You do remind me of the story of how the great Gaelic storytellers, obviously in the oral tradition, we're taught the stories, and I've heard this idea from a few people where the way they were taught, and some of these stories are like 20, 30 hours long, and somebody asked an old man who was one of the last people who could do this, how he was taught to remember. And he said, what you do is you look at a piece of blank wall and you imagine a picture on it and you describe the picture, and then you replace it with another picture and describe that picture. Of course, what I'm saying here is that the Gaels invented cinema thousands of years ago. But that effectively, so it's kind of, they cross over, don't they, Neil? They cross the two things, intertwine. And perhaps the reason that if we have got anything together that works, it's because it's the two bits of the brain are working at the same time. Because I prefer the showing bit. I did Line of Duty with Jed Mercurio, the brilliant Jed Mercurio, and people tend to talk about Jed like he's a wordsmith a little bit. And he is, he's a brilliant wordsmith, but you should see his scene directions. They're so precise and so amazing. Same with Stephen Moffat, it's like poetry with scene directions, and Russell and so on. And obviously Neil does that as well. In fact, sometimes Neil's stage directions have got nothing to do with what's happening on screen. So they're slightly different. So you have to interpret them for him, but as long as it works, it works. And
that takes me to this idea of collaboration. And finding the people that we want to collaborate with. Now, kind of over the years, you've both collaborated with lots of different people, and some of those sort of partnerships have gone on for more than one project. How is it that you went on that journey of finding those people? And are there any that maybe you've not worked with in a while, but you're like, right, we've got that thing that we want to do together, and we're going to do it in the next 5-10 years?
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of people I'd love to collaborate with, but right now collaborating with Neil is just fantastic, because it feels like we're both in the right place to do the work together. And I don't know, there's a thing without blowing smoke that works with Neil in a really strange way, that we never argue about stuff. Things evolve as we talk. It's kind of a really weird sort of thing where he knows if I push back on something and I don't understand it, if I do it often enough, he's got to try and explain it to me, because I'm kind of representing the audience, and going, well, if I don't get it, nobody's going to get it. And then he'll come up with a thought and I'll bounce off that. So it's a proper collaboration, but also I know Neil's Neil, so he's got the, we collaborate well in all sorts of different ways in production, I think, as well as the creative side. On the production side, I like to say lots of people know what Neil likes, but I know what he doesn't like, because instinctively I get that completely. And it's the same, I think it's the same for you, Neil.
Yeah. I think one of the things that Douglas is also absolutely brilliant at is sending me little emails saying, this is actually what you need to say to these people to get this result. Because Douglas will go, okay, if he sends that email, it won't work. But if I go in and push the same set of buttons, we'll probably get the couple of coins coming out of the jackpot thing that we needed.
Yeah, don't give too much away, Neil.
You're giving away all your tricks.
Is true. That is not true. That has never happened. Never will happen. But it can be really collaborative on a number of ways.
I suppose Good Omens began as this partnership between you and Terry, and so you've spoken a lot in the past about the process of trying to bring it to life a number of times. And so what was it about when you connected with Douglas that you knew, right, this is the person, this is the time, it's going to happen, and we're going to make it happen? And I guess also for you, Douglas, how did you know this was a project that you just absolutely had to be a part of? What was the draw for you?
Well, I can answer one bit. I mean, first of all, I was asked eventually, to look at the scripts, and I didn't know that Neil had a house in Skye at this point. And our first phone call, I think, was Neil was in Australia going for a walk, and he said, "Oh, you're from Skye?" And I went, "Yeah." And most of my career has been spent being ridiculed for coming from such a daft place to be in television, and people say, "Oh, you go on about it so much." Then suddenly there was this guy who had these amazing scripts, he was telling me that he wrote the scripts on Sky at his house. And then I was telling him stories about Sky, and so I think the Sky thing was a huge thing for us as a kind of a common interest thing, which was a big start. But then it was just simply, it was the work. I mean, I tend to think, I never liked the words masterclass, by the way. I think it all sounds a bit pompous, but even going with that, I tend to think that if your career is going well, each job should be a preparation for the next job in a way, and it should work out that way. And kind of what happened to me was that I'd had a time when I was doing Line of Duty and Doctor Who for a few years, which was, if somebody had said, do you want to do that for the rest of your career? I'd have said, yeah, that's fine. That'd be really good. Thank you very much. And then Stephen Moffat and Hartswood let me go on the 10th episode of Sherlock. And that was the thing I think brought me to an exec producer's attention and then on to Neil. But I hadn't read Good Omens when I read the scripts. David Tennant hadn't read it either, so that helped. But Michael Sheen had profoundly read it many times. And I think somewhere in there we got a good mix together, Neil, don't you think?
Yeah, I do. Douglas first came on my radar with Jekyll. And the first 3, I think, episodes of Jekyll. And I'd watched it because it was Stephen Moffat, and I will watch anything that Stephen Moffat writes. But I really went, okay, there's a director here who's really interesting. And so that was the point that I started noticing Douglas, and then going, okay, he's doing Doctor Who's and things too. But I think, yeah, the initial bonding with Sky, it actually gave us something that we had as a weird kind of shared universe. We both knew what we were talking about. There is an oddness to the people of Sky, whether it's the people who were born there or the people who found it and went, this is my place. And I think that and it always meant that we had something to talk about. If on the worst days of Good Omens, it's on the days when somebody from the BBC would swing in, say, hello, just thought you'd like to know the accountants have just looked at the numbers again, and we're currently dealing with the £1.2 million budget shortfall. Okay, got to go off to a meeting now. Bye. And they go away. Douglas and I would sit and we'd go, Sky. And we'd talk about Sky for a bit. It was great. This, oddly enough, happened several times during the making of Good Omens. But it was also a sort of the Neil and Douglas thing. What I like about it actually is it wasn't an immediate love fest. It wasn't like I met Douglas and went, you are the director I've been waiting all my life for. And he went, you're the great writer. We kind of had to earn each other's trust. And then we earned each other's respect. And then somewhere in there, we realized we'd actually become friends in sort of, by being in combat together. So it was a sort of a very slow, solid process that took whatever it was, the 2 years of making Good Omens. But we came out of it going, okay, I came out of it going, I want to work with you more. This is good. I trust you utterly and absolutely. I know what you went through to bring us Good Omens, and you did it, and you were there.
I mean, it's a relationship, we're happy for in the industry, considering everything that's coming off it now. I just want to stick with place for a second. And Douglas, you've had to leave home and work away from Scotland for such a long time. And now you're kind of in a space where you're able to come back home, work here, bring the work here, grow something here. I mean, how does that feel? Was that something back when you were making those decisions of what was the next job that you were going to take and taking you away from the place you called home? Is that something you hoped for, you planned for?
Yeah, one thing, and I say this without bitterness because I'm very happy where I am, But there was bitterness at the time. I've never been offered any drama in Scotland. BBC Scotland have never offered me a drama ever. So that option kind of wasn't there. So I had to go away. But then I come from Sky, so I've always had to come away anyway. So, you're always away, really. I'll tell you, there was a moment where, so big thing, and hopefully we'll talk about it. We should talk about the training we're doing in Good Omens. But the moment where I think I crossed a bit of a Rubicon was I did a couple of episodes of Outlander. That was the last time I worked in Scotland in series 2. And I was shooting the breeze with an American executive. And she said to me, "So what are you doing next?" And I said, "Oh, I'll probably head back to London and see, although I've never lived in London, but I'll head down to London to see if there's any work around." And she said, "Oh, I've never been there. I've never been to London. What's it like?" And I suddenly had this kind of, the furniture in my head shifted, and the idea that a top level exec had never been to London was just like a wondrous thing, so you can make one of the biggest TV series in the world and you don't have to go to London anymore. And I'm not saying that I then sort of worked out all the paths to get here, because that would involve me organising the pandemic, which would not be good. But when the moment came to bring Good Omens and Anansi Boys here, through lots of twists and turns, it was really clear to me that we could make it here, and that there was nothing shy about it, because I've worked in countries of similar sort of size, with similar sort of industries, like the Czech Republic and Hungary and so on, and even South Africa. But I've also been in places like Vancouver, where they had 50 television series being made at the same time when I was there. But I've got no fears at all about bringing these shows here. And, we'll do the usual thing. We'll have to import some people, but actually we've got the cream of the crop of local talent. And even the word local makes it sound slightly embarrassed about it. And I think what I'm glad about is that finally bringing these shows here with Neil, it feels like everyone's ready to make them, and there's no shyness about it. And I think that, there's good and bad things about the streamers, just like there is about, the BBC and ITV and so on. And if you land in a happy patch, then it can be good for you. And this is certainly a happy patch for us and for Scotland. And just to talk about the training briefly, in case we forget about it, we're doing a big training scheme with Anansi Boys in a slightly different way, but with Good Omens, Creative Scotland and Scottish Screen Scotland are joining with us to create a big training scheme that kind of follows on from Outlander. And so we're going to get about 20 people, which is quite a big figure, that are going to work across all departments. And I've just started meeting them, and they've just started working with us. And the joy on these people's faces of coming along to work on Good Omens is just amazing. They can't quite believe it's Good Omens, because a lot of them are fans already. But we've also tried to do a training scheme where there's just no nepotism at all. You can't push your way in, no matter who even if you know Neil Gaiman and Douglas Mackinnon together, you couldn't push your way in. It's a level playing field. We've even got people coming from the Highlands, and we're going to pay for their accommodation and travel, so they've got a level playing field. And hopefully, with diversity, it's the same sort of thing. And it's going to be really interesting to see what that bunch of people do, and then with us, but then what happens to them afterwards. So I guess it's a wrong. I go back to that first thought. It's how can we change the furniture of the industry, and we do that by action, not just intentionality. We have to do it. It's the same as diversity. We have to actually do stuff, not just talk about doing stuff.
Yeah, we need to make the opportunities happen.
Yeah,
and then it'll all cross-pollinate. We have a question from Lenny Henry here, and it's sticking with this idea of place as well. So we'll let Lenny ask the question.
Hello, everybody. It's Lenny Henry here. I want to ask Neil about the importance of place when you're writing, because it seems to me that where you are can affect the kind of writing you're doing. And I wonder if Neil has a special place or places where he is creatively at his best. That's my question.
Good question, Lenny. I think where you are can absolutely affect what you write. I think sometimes it can do it in upside down ways. I look at when I moved to America in the 90s, and what I wrote, the personal projects that came out of moving to America, the first couple, were Neverwhere, which is a London novel, and Stardust, which is an English fairyland novel. And they both came out because I was homesick. And so I was writing about where I wasn't and where I couldn't be. But then I wouldn't have written American Gods if I hadn't have spent at that point, I think, about 8 years in America. And I've been looking around going, this place is weird. I should write about it. Nobody here. There's 300 million people living here and they haven't noticed it's weird. And I have, so I better write that down. I think there can be amazing writing places. My favorite writing place in the world is my desk on Sky. I've got this strange room that's a library and on the ground floor and an office, and it has a staircase going up, and at the top there's a little desk by the window, and I can just sit there, look out the window and write. And the only thing I ever have to worry about are the days when the view out the window is so glorious that I spend more time looking out the window than I do writing. But that's sort of my happy place. It's my favorite place to write, my favorite place to be. But I do think where you are changes what you're writing. And I also love writing in places that I'm not comfortable. Borrowed houses, other people's houses are great to go and write in because you kind of feel a bit awkward and you just sort of, it's much more comfortable being in your book or in your script than it is sort of being in their house.
Great, thank you. That was a great answer to that question.
Can we also say that happily Lenny Henry is working with us on Anansi Boys. He's writing an episode and he's a co-exec producer, which is great.
How is that feeling of working across Good Omens season 2 and the Anansi Boys in Scotland? How are you feeling balancing all of that? Is it just kind of just work all the time? You must be super excited, obviously, but
on, I think it was September the 16th of last year, Douglas and I, particularly Douglas, have been putting together giant ways of doing this. But even then, it was still a plan of do Anansi Boys, then do Good Omens. And we got the phone call from Amazon and they said, well, we've got good news and interesting news. The good news is we're greenlighting both Good Omens 2 and Anansi Boys. The interesting news is, how would you feel about doing them at the same time? And we decided that it was feasible.
And can I jump in there? Because I think it was a key moment. And it was a good call, it's not a bad call. It was a good call. And but my reaction, which was pretty immediate, was the only way we can do this is if we take them both to Scotland. We then had to prove that we could do it, but that was the key moment. And with all this production that we're taking to Scotland, that was the moment. And I remember there was sort of slightly bemused stares down the Zoom conference from Los Angeles about, what did he say, Scotland? And I think they all went away afterwards trying to work out where Scotland was and realizing they didn't actually know. And then are there people there that can turn on a camera and stuff like that? But others were cleverer. Some of our own execs were very good, and we worked our way through. I actually think what's happening to us in the way that Gaelic medium school kids seem to be better at maths than one language students, because they have to work out things in two areas at the same time. For me, that's what's happening with me and Good Omens and Anansi Boys, is that I'm really loving it, and it's actually the challenge of swapping backwards and forwards that people sort of fear. It's fantastic, and it's also the longest time I haven't directed in my entire career. So it's just like being in a really lovely warm bath all the time. It's just fantastic.
That's a very good analogy. And does working with the streamers as opposed to the public broadcasters give you a lot more freedom? Like, what do you feel that adds to what you can do? I mean, you've spoken about the opportunities that you've been able to create as well. And do you think that by working with the streamers, you're able to make bolder moves, I guess?
Well, it's worth mentioning here and highlighting that the BBC Studios are our studio for making Good Omens too. So we're absolutely working with the resources and backing of one of the public broadcasters. The problem there being that the BBC's pockets only go as deep as that share of the license fee for that project, which these days is not necessarily deep enough. I would say right now, having worked with streamers, that there's been an evolution. When Douglas and I came on to Good Omens, the Amazon BBC collaboration, Amazon was the Wild West. Everything there was very haphazard. They just discovered this thing. There was a certain amount of chaos, which allowed for creativity and creative solutions, and also allowed for minor disasters to happen as people would blithely say, oh yeah, that'll be fine, and then disappear, never to be seen again. And 6 months later, we wound up reaping the consequences of that. So both of those things happened. These days, Amazon is much more organized. I'm dealing with Netflix on Sandman. They're very organized. What's really good is they have big ambitions, and they're making television that they want the entire world to watch. And that feels huge for me. Not only do we get to change things, however much we get to change them in Scotland by doing productions of this size here, and hopefully more of them. But we also get to make something that goes all the way around the world.
I think all of that's true, but I'd also say that there is a fundamental thing with American television, be it the streamers or not, where showrunners are at the heart of the process. And some of the names we mentioned are names like Stephen Moffat and Russell T Davies and Sally Wainwright, who are showrunners, but they don't have the same sort of power as showrunners in the States. And but having said that, they probably mostly get their own way because they've proved their merits, obviously. I can't think of a single moment in the whole of Good Omens, series 1 or 2 so far, where anybody's even tried to override a decision that we make, having listened to them and talked to them. It's a genuine creative collaboration, but they really want us to be happy, and us being happy means us finally deciding on everything, from the smallest thing to the biggest thing.
I'd say that's true of Netflix as well, having worked with them on Sandman. I watch the social media people going, it's a Netflix show. Netflix are telling them what to do. It's like, no, this is our show, and they're funding it, and it's great, but they trust us, and they hired us to do it because they figure that if you're going to make Sandman, you need Neil Gaiman, and then you need to listen to him, and it's great.
Absolutely. Speaking of Stephen Moffat, he sent you a question, Douglas.
Oh yeah.
So we're going to play that now.
My question, like I imagine most of the questions have been, is for Douglas. Yet another question for Douglas. Good Omens is very funny, well done on that, but it's also, it has to be said, a bit end of the worldy, and that's, that can be a tricky balance, one I'm not completely unfamiliar with, but it's a very tricky balance. Obviously, comedy depends on Jeopardy. Any fool knows that. But too much Jeopardy, and the comedy just sort of switches off. So, Douglas, how do you find the right tone with the performances, with the style of it? It has to be real enough that you care. Otherwise, you're never going to laugh. But if you care too much, you'll you'll just basically feel too harrowed to enjoy it. You won't feel as though you're allowed to. So I'm wondering how you approach the performances and the sort of general look and feel, all of which is wonderful on the show, how you do that. Obviously, Neil's answer to this question is just do exactly what it says in the script, and that's basically true. But why don't you elaborate on that, Douglas?
Thank you, Stephen Moffat, for a typically annoying question. And he knows the answer I'm going to give completely, because for me, the tone 100% comes from the script. 100% comes from the words that Stephen writes or Neil writes, and that's where I start and finish. I find any glory I get from directing is based on following the script and following the story religiously, and that's my answer, Stephen. That's where I find the tone. It's with the words. Yeah, you're the most important person, Stephen. Fair enough. And actually, Raisah, you asked earlier about, are there any secret projects that you'd love to do with previous collaborators? Up until this moment, I was going to say, I'd love to go back and do more Jekyll. Now I'm not quite so sure.
He's ruined it. He's ruined his chances. We are rapidly...
Also, unlike Stephen Fry, he didn't apologise for the beard. I think apologising for the beard when you come on and do a video question is very important.
It's a pandemic look, isn't it, for many?
Yeah.
We are on to our final questions because we've ran out of time. So this one should be an easy one, I hope. If there's one book or screenplay that you'd tell writers to read, then what would that be? And I would have the same question, but with TV shows or films. What do you think are absolutely vital for people to watch, which help them see what they should or shouldn't do?
I'd point people at William Goldman's book, Adventures in the Screen Trade, because I remember reading that, and somewhere embedded in the core of it was the idea that nobody knows anything and that everybody just explains successes afterwards as if they were obvious, but they never were. But he also, in there, with telling you that execs, in people in studios, nobody knows anything. He also really illuminates the fact that everybody on a film set has a craft. Everybody knows what they're doing and that they can bring things to it. And he writes a small demo script and sends it out to friends, and they come back and say, oh, well, if I was shooting that, maybe we'd put her on a plank and lower it and raise it while we're doing it. And realizing as a young writer that you better listen, because there are people out there who know so much more than you and are going to have amazing ideas and will make this thing better, was huge for me. So that, I think, all of the books about film and TV I've ever read, that had the most influence on me.
I mean, it's very much the same for me, but I'd also point out the Wall Will Tell You, Hampton Fancher's book, who wrote Blade Runner. I think that's a great book for just browsing and just finding little inspirational things as a director as well as a writer. I've also got a very pompous one. Ian Forster did a set of lectures called Aspects of the Novel that are published. And I think that's fantastic for storytelling and understanding directing and understanding the most basic storytelling possible. I'd point at that as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. We have run out of time, unfortunately. On behalf of everyone watching, a big thank you to Douglas and Neil for a brilliant Edinburgh Television Festival session. And we would like to say thank you to our session sponsor, Screen Scotland.